No, Sarah. Let's go down and have prayer. And let's ask God for forgiveness for even a suggestion like this, because this suggestion is not of God. This suggestion is of Satan. He should have did that. But what did they do? They went ahead and what? Went on anyway. Why? Because Sarah herself thought she was in the way of the promise. Remember again, if we're trying to figure it out, you're going to forfeit your promise. Even though you're moving on living faith, I'm moving on living faith. But if you're still if you stop and try to, okay, maybe the Lord's saying this way, I still don't see the promise. I don't feel the promise. So obviously I got to do something myself. I got to move. So she thought she was in the way of the promise. So she was saying, hey, Abraham, okay, I move out the way. And don't you know, Abraham actually agreed. He obviously said, yes, Sarah, you're right. Honey, you're in the way of the promise. And how do you think you really felt? I mean, Sarah, you are, it's your fault. Literally, it's your fault. It's your fault we don't have children. It's not me, it's you. You're old now. There's no way in the world you're going to have a child. This is the main lesson that we need to understand. Because did they break one of God's commandments? Yes or no? God said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but Abraham went with it anyway. God said only a man and a woman wife, one, to be two people united as one, right? He didn't say three people united as one or four people united as one. He said a man and a woman, and that's it. Not a man and a woman. But so now he's in violation. And notice something here. Notice something. The promise is never activated by breaking the commandments of God. And that's something we always have to remember. So God, there's no way in the world God was going to honor that. Because the promise is never activated by breaking the commandments of God. So what were the results of them actually, hey, you can have my handmaid? And he did it. He went, he conceived, Hagar conceived, and what were the results? Was it happy bliss? But they're like, yes, now we got the promise Ishmael. That's the name of the child that came. She is the promised one now. And was Sarah happy and saying, oh, this is the promised one? Was she happy? No. Would you? Come on. Of course not. No, it's not. She's not happy. Because obviously this woman, she is of childbearing age, and he's 80-something years old. She's 86 years old. She had to be probably 40 years old or 30. This young woman, of course, she was not happy. So as a result, it was pain, chaos, and confusion. Doesn't it remind you of somebody? Because you know who was behind it all along was Satan. Satan says, hey, what about Hagar? She is a beautiful person. I think the lineage should come through her. Just imagine. But what happens when we violate God's law? Pain, chaos, and confusion. What happened when Adam and Eve violated the law? Pain, chaos, and confusion in the end. Even though Satan tried to paint the picture, it's going to be all blissful. So we see here that Abraham was 86 years old when he had Ishmael. Was the promise going to be activated through Ishmael? Well, God revealed, no, it's not going to be activated. Genesis 17 made it clear. 13 years later, after Ishmael, he's growing up now, and the whole household saying, this is the one, this is the one. And you can imagine Sarah be like, oh man, I shouldn't have done this. Because she did admit it herself later on. I made a mistake. I was wrong. I made a mistake. So let's look at this. Genesis 17, 1 through 8. We find, I just have to summarize because of my time. We find here in Genesis 17, 1 through 8, when you get a chance to read it, Abraham now, he is 99 years old. And God changes the Abraham's name from Abram to Abram, which means father of many nations. Now this time, there's some time that goes through Abraham's life. Now he went from 86, now he's 99 years old. And this is interesting that God calls him Abraham, father of many nations, is a constant reminder of the what? Promise. His name is about the promise now. You are going to be father of many nations. Then we find in verses 15 through 16, 13 years later, since Ishmael's birth, God reveals to Sarah, reveals to Abraham. Let me tell you something, Abraham. Ishmael's not the one. As a matter of fact, it's going to come from your wife, Sarah. Now, I know he's like, what? Ishmael is not. Yes, he will be a father of many. He will have multitudes of people. But he is not the promise. The promise is not coming through Ishmael. The promise is coming through Sarah. Now, what was his response to that? Huh? What was Abraham's response? Verse 17 and 18. What was when God said it's going to come through Sarah? He died what? He kind of got on his face and, in his heart, he laughed. He laughed. And don't you know, if you look in the original Hebrew, laugh means mockery. In his heart, he mocked God because Sarah was too old. He was too old. So again, he's saying, Lord, wait a minute. What about Ishmael? What about Ishmael? When he laughed, he said, wait a minute. What about Ishmael? And God says, no, it's not Ishmael. It's coming through Sarah. So it's interesting. He laughs. And in verse 19, what's God's response? In verse 19, God's response is, you're going to name the child Isaac, right? And what does Isaac mean? Laughter. He named the promised child Isaac, which means laughter, mockery, as a rebuke for mocking God. But at the same time, it's going to be a reminder of the promise and the power of God. You're going to laugh. You laughing. You laughing, Abraham, aren't you? Well, I'm going to name your son Laughter so you can remember your laugh. And you will feel the rebuke, and you will fall on your knees for forgiveness because you're going to see the power of God. You see, the thing you'll understand, Abraham really didn't know God as he thought he knew God. He didn't understand the power of God like he thought, because if he understood the power of God, he would have said, yes, sir, yes, sir. He would not break his commandment. We should never break God's commandment trying to fulfill the promise. So God establishes that promise that will be through Isaac. And then we see in verse 21, God repeats the promise to Abraham that it will be established through Isaac. But he tells Abraham, we have to look at verse 1. How much time I got left? Okay. Now he gives Abraham the time Isaac will be born. Let's look at this, because this is interesting, because it also teaches a lesson. That God, look at it, verse 21. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee this set time in the next year. So God had an appointed time. He's saying, Abraham, remember this, your son will be born unto Sarah this time next year. He had an appointed time. Does God have an appointed time? Yes, he does. Jesus Christ said, I am coming again. He has an appointed time. He is coming back. He has an appointed time here in Anson County, right here in this whole region. He has an appointed time that he will move his Holy Spirit like never before, because God said, I will pour out my spirit. He said, I will pour it out. That's the latter rain. And when he pours out his spirit, some things are going to happen. Transformation is going to happen here like never before since apostolic times. I truly believe it. He has an appointed time. But we see here when Sarah gets wind of what she's going to have a baby, what's her response? What's her response? She laughs. I'm going to have a child. I'm old. She laughs. In other words, again, she mocks God. And in verse 14, let's look at that. Verse 14, chapter 16, verse 14. Chapter 16, verse 14. And it says, let's look at this, the last part. Let's look at the, not sure. Genesis 18, rather. Wrong one, not 16. Genesis 18. We're in Genesis 18 now. Verse 14, and it says, what? Everybody read that. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return unto thee, and according to the time of life Sarah shall have a son. Is anything too hard for me? Nothing. God is saying, I am God, the same God who implanted in Mary Jesus Christ without having sex. So the same God can implant an egg, a gamete cell inside the womb of Mary. There's nothing too hard for God. That's what he's saying. So we see here in Genesis 21, verses 1 through 2, did God fulfill the promise? Did God fulfill the promise? What does it say in verse 1, 21 verses 1 through 2? And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son of his old age. When did he do it? When did he do it? Was he late? Was he early? At the set time which God had spoken to him. So Isaac was born at the appointed time. Amen. It happened. It was a miracle. This woman was barren. She had no way of having children, but God made it possible to have a child. To have a child. Isn't that something? That's powerful. Now, is the promise activated? They have this child now. Is the promise activated? No. Still not activated. No, it's not activated yet. As Isaac grows and Abraham faith ripens. Now he's learning some lessons now. He's learned a lot of lessons because he had to send Hagar away and his child away, but God took care of them because it caused a lot of problems in the house. But Abraham, he's learned some lessons now, and as he grows, his ripens, does he now have the character trait needed to activate the promise? Does he now have the character? He went through a lot now. I mean, he did a lot of time. He's left around, I think he was around, we don't know exactly, around 75 years old. And look how the time has gone by. But we see, what does God do? What does God do? He puts Abraham to the test to see if he received the character trait in order to activate the promise. In other words, he's saying to you and I, before the promise is right there, your car is right there, before I give you the keys and before I give you the power to turn that key on to activate the promise, I got to test you, just like your driving test, right? They don't say, well, you get your license and everything, you can go out, you can be fully legal on the road without taking a test. So God had to give him a test. And what to say for you and I? He's going to test you and I too. He's going to test. So he puts Abraham to the test. Now, what was the test? Of course, we find that in Genesis 22. And we all know the story. In Genesis 22, God said, I will need you to sacrifice the promise. What? Sacrifice the promise? This is my only hope. But Abraham was so ripened in faith. And he had the character that God says, this is the one. He said, sacrifice your only begotten son. And Abraham said, well, I understand the power of God now. See, before he didn't understand the power of God. He didn't believe that God can make his 90-year-old wife fertile. But now he's seen the power of God. Now he knows who God is. So Abram's like, okay, Lord, I know you're so powerful, Lord. You made the promise, Lord. He says in Hebrews, we can go there real quick. Hebrews 11. Tell me when I got 5. Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11. Verses 17 through 19. Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. Check this out. Because we know Abraham now, he knows who God is. And no doubt about it. It's no flinching with Abraham. Because if God say, I want you to sacrifice your only son, we'll be, what in the world? This must not be of God. But Abraham knew God now. He knew his voice. He knew everything. He knew God. And we see here, verse 17, it says, now Abraham, when he was tried, he was what? Tried meaning he was tested. And going back to Genesis 22, it says he was tempted, but that tempted meaning not tempted